Welcome back for another conversation at the intersection of science and spirituality with Deepak Chopra and Don Hoffman. As you may have joined us before for some of our earlier episodes, we've been exploring the meaning of consciousness, drawing from some of Deepak's 91 plus books that he's written, as well as Don's book, The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. Deepak, I thought today perhaps that you could start us off by explaining to us the Vedantic perspective on what pure consciousness means, and then perhaps we can have Don explain it from a more scientific perspective.
Okay, so that's a good question, Jen. Let me start by sharing with you. There are three traditions that are very closely related in the Eastern wisdom traditions, particularly the ones that come from India. So the first is Vedanta, which is, I would say, consciousness-only monism. It holds that only consciousness exists, and everything else is actually an appearance in consciousness that is also consciousness, but it looks different because consciousness by itself has no form. So that's in Vedanta, but it's also in a whole discipline called Kashmir Shaivism, which goes back about 1,000 years. And that the exponent of that was somebody called Abhinava Gupta, who influenced the export of non-dual thinking into Nepal, and that became the Nepalese version of Buddhism as well. So if you go in deep into the literature of Vedanta, Kashmir Shaivism, Tantra, you see all these philosophies, which are consciousness-only monism, matter-only monism, and then dualism, mind and matter, two different things. Now, even though Vedanta talks about dualism, it says that dualism is an experience, but it's not the reality. So let me explain how that works in these traditions. The consciousness is the ground of all experience. I'll repeat that very carefully. Consciousness is the ground of all experience. So consciousness is that in which all experience occurs. All experience is known, but also out of which all experience is made. That third part is very important. So consciousness is in which all experience occurs. The experience of this book is happening in consciousness. The experience of this hand is happening in consciousness. Where else could it be happening? It's not happening in the brain because there's no experience in the brain. There are no colors in the brain. There are no forms in the brain. There are no shapes in the brain. There's no sound in the brain. Nothing that we can call experience can actually be seen or even experienced in the brain. What we find in the brain are what are called neural correlates of experience, but even those are an experience. Somebody has to experience the neural correlates of experience to call them neural correlates. So even the brain is an experience in consciousness. So once again, consciousness is that in which all experience occurs, all experience is known, out of which all experience is made. So you say, well, how is the experience of this iPhone or this book or this hand made out of consciousness? Well, the only way I can know this phone or this watch or this hand or this body is through experiencing it in an alchemy of 5 fluctuations of consciousness: sound, touch, sight, taste, and smell. So the activity of hearing is actually a modulation of consciousness. The activity of seeing is a modulation of consciousness. Consciousness knows itself as this color. Consciousness knows itself as this form. Consciousness knows itself as this sensation. Consciousness knows itself as this sound, this taste, and this smell. But then consciousness, once it knows itself as this perception, but even that is misleading, because before I can call this a book, before I can call this a phone, before I can call this a watch or a hand, all it is qualia. Qualia meaning English word, quality of awareness. But in the Sanskrit, qualia are fluctuations of consciousness. The dense fluctuations, lower frequency fluctuations of consciousness. And they're all, by the way, called vrittis or shaktis. So that's also a name for the divine feminine. Pure consciousness, the divine masculine. But as it fluctuates, the low frequency fluctuations become what we call the five senses and their qualia: sounds, shapes, colors, forms, tastes, smells, textures. But then consciousness also fluctuates at higher frequencies, which are called mind and intellect and ego in the biological organism that we're speaking of as the human being. So the high frequency fluctuations are called the subtle body, which is mind, intellect, and ego. The low frequency fluctuations are called perceptions or qualia that we associate with the five senses. So what is fluctuating? Fluctuating pure consciousness. And that pure consciousness doesn't by itself have any attributes. It's just a possibility field. It's formless and it has no edges or defined edges. It's inconceivable because it's not in space-time. Its fluctuations create the experience of space-time, but even the processing of space-time is happening in consciousness. And in fact, the Vedanta says this infinite space of consciousness is not an empty void. It's also eternal time. So infinite space and eternal time, but not time as in endless duration, but as in timelessness. So outside of time and beyond time. And that when we give meaning to qualia, when we give meaning to colors, shapes, and forms visually, that becomes an object out there. But actually, there's no object out there. Just replace the word object with the word experience, and then you're all set. Yeah, so every object is an experience. Whether it's an animate object or inanimate, it doesn't matter. It's an experience. So all we experience is sensations. That's it. Find sensations that we call mind, and then we can kind of conceptualize that as the intellect and ego, and then dense fluctuations, which we call body and the physical world. So a rock is a modified experience of consciousness experiencing itself as the rock. A person is a changing fluctuation of consciousness perceptually from fertilized egg to ovum, to zygote, to embryo, to baby, to toddler, all the way to dusty death. This is a program, and the program has a code, and the code is qualia, but when you give meaning to the qualia, it becomes perception, which we then reify as the physical world, objective world. So actually my body is an extension of my conditioned mind, and the conditioned mind is a modification of consciousness, which is a field of possibilities. It's non-locally correlated and tangled with all experience of every species and in all organisms. So superposition of possibilities at all times. It is infinitely correlated. It's unpredictable. It is the source of attention and intention. And it is modifying itself as what humans call mind, body, and the physical world. Now, the fluctuations are not reliable. They are magical lies. And so these magical lies are called Maya. Maya is the goddess of basically illusion. So Maya in the Sanskrit word is related to matter, to meter, to music, to time, to measurement. Anything that can be experienced is not real because it's a fluctuation and it's unreliable. It tells us the earth is flat and nobody believes that. It tells us the ground is stationary, nobody believes that. It tells us that things are solid. Nobody believes that anymore, even in science. So Maya leads ultimately to the play of consciousness, which is called Leela. So to what purpose? And Leela is the play of consciousness. Maya is the illusion, the magical lie. And then the question is asked, to what purpose? And the answer is, we don't know. Consciousness, by definition, wants to be conscious because that's what we call consciousness. It needs to have experience. So it curves back within itself and it creates experience by modifying itself into knowers, modes of knowing, and things known, which are both species and culture specific, but they're all magical lies. And it's all consciousness entertaining itself as the play of the universe. And even it goes further. They say there are metaverses, there are multiple infinite universes. And there's a phrase in the Yoga Vishishta: infinite universes come and go in the vast expanse of consciousness, like motes of dust dancing in a beam of light. So what we call experience requires three things: an experiencer, a mode of experiencing, and that which is experienced; a knower, a mode of knowing, and that which is known; a seer, a process of seeing, and that which is seen or scenery. However, having said all that, it also says, the Vedanta also says, that the seer, the scener, and the scenery, the seer and the scenery are byproducts of seeing. Actually, there's only seeing. There's only the activity of seeing. Or the hearer and that which is heard, the sound, are byproducts of the activity called hearing. So these techniques that we have called metacognition, you focus not on the scenery, but on the activity of seeing. You become aware on the activity of seeing, and you realize that in every act of seeing, a new seer and a new scenery is born. That's a very short summary of how consciousness conceives, constructs, governs, and becomes everything that we call the metaverse.
Well, I think that's a mic drop, Deepak. You just basically solved all of human wonders and quandaries there in that 15-minute segment. So we can just call it a show. What do you think? All kidding aside, Don, you bring a very unique scientific perspective on things with your book, The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. If you could extrapolate for us, perhaps, on your perspective, just to tie it back in case somebody may have missed one of our earlier episodes, on the scientific perspective of consciousness, as you allude to in the book, that what we're seeing is really not the truth, and that we have not evolved to see the capital T truth, but rather for fitness points and survival.
Very good. Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Deepak. That was a wonderful summary of those points of view, and a very beautiful summary. And science, I think, has been studying what you called the reification of the perceptions. Right? We reify our perceptions of objects and space and time, and we assume that space and time are fundamental, and that physical objects like protons and neutrons and quarks and so forth are part of the fundamental furniture of the universe, and that human beings and our brains and our consciousness somehow emerge from all that. That's been the standard scientific view. But the nice thing about science is we force ourselves to make mathematically precise predictions from our theories, and those theories can start to contradict our very intuitions that we use to create the theories. And so evolution by natural selection is one of those theories where we came into the theory assuming that space and time are fundamental, creatures and organisms are fundamental, and they're in a struggle for survival, and we wrote down the equations for that. And it turns out when you look at those equations, they entail that the sensory systems of all organisms were evolved not to show the truth, but to show only fitness consequences of your actions. So the probability, according to evolutionary theory, that space and time and physical objects are the fundamental reality, the probability of that is zero, precisely zero. Now, evolutionary theory doesn't tell us what the reality is. It just tells us that whatever the reality might be, sensory systems of organisms were not shaped to see it. With probability zero, they were shaped to see it. So that aligns pretty well with what you were saying from the spiritual traditions, that space and time are not fundamental. They're just forms. And the way I put it is that they're just part of a user interface from the evolutionary point of view. And we get the same conclusion from physics, which of course physics has been for centuries the study of what happens in space and time, or more recently, what happens in space-time when we unite space and time. But now our best theories, quantum theory and relativity theory, special and general, together tell us, as various physicists now put it, that space-time is doomed. Nima Arkani Hamed, among them, is one of the more prominent voices. Space-time is doomed, and physicists are now looking for a reality beyond space-time, beyond space and time both, not just space, but beyond time as well. And they don't have it yet. They're finding interesting structures, something called amplituhedron, cosmological polytopes, associahedron, and so forth. So they're finding these interesting structures, but they don't know what it's about yet. So science is groping its way towards what you said, which is that what we see is just a perception, and science has reified that perception when it assumed that space and time and objects are fundamental. But now we're seeing, for example, in the quantum Bayesian or cubism approach to physics, Chris Fuchs, David Merman, and others, Rüdiger Schack, they point out that every act of observation in physics is what they call an act of fact creation. You create what you see in the moment, which is exactly what I say in my book, according to evolution, that we create what we see in our perceptions. And so science is moving. Most scientists are still physicalists because even most spiritual people, in our heart of hearts, most of us buy the reification, right? That's just sort of built into us. It takes a lot of spiritual training and meditation to begin to free yourself from that addiction to the reification. And so science is moving that in that direction. So I see a convergence.
So Jennifer, as we were speaking, this arrived in my mail yesterday, the New Scientist, the latest issue. It says, do we create space time, a new way to think about the fabric of reality? This is the latest issue of the New Scientist. And I know, Don, you've spoken at the New Scientist headquarters in England after your book. But then I started to read the article. It's by Amanda Gefter, who's a very gifted science writer. Yes. She was at one of our conferences, Sages and Scientists. You were there as well. And she wrote an extraordinary book inspired by John Wheeler. And, because John Wheeler says the boundary of a boundary is not a boundary, and that the boundary of a boundary is limitless. And she uses that in her entire book. But now she has this article, and obviously it says a lot of the things that you're talking about, including quantum Bayesianism. But, as I read this and as read everything else about even do we create space-time, it does not define who the we is, and the we, you and I would say, is a conscious agent. But she, along with everybody else, the we is a conscious observer that's an embodied person. But what you and I are saying is even the person is a process in the conscious agent, along with the brain and everything else. Would you agree on that?
That's right. I would say that the bodies that we're perceiving right now are simply avatars in a virtual reality that we're creating through consciousness. And I think that eventually science has the tools to do this rigorously. And I think science will eventually take the ideas that you just so nicely and clearly presented at the very start of this conversation and turn them as much as possible into mathematically rigorous ideas. I think that's in the cards. And perhaps substantial work will be done in our lifetime in that direction. Science has the tools to start to write down mathematical models of consciousness. Now, and I should say my own view about mathematical models in science and their limits. My own view is that Gödel's incompleteness theorem entails that there's an infinity of mathematical truths. And no finite set of axioms of a theory can ever get anywhere near being able to prove all those truths. So no scientific theory can ever capture all of the truth by a long shot. In fact, quite the opposite. Every scientific theory will only scratch the surface. And that's in principle, because no theory can ever explain. There is no theory of everything. No theory can explain everything. Every scientific theory makes assumptions, and those assumptions are the miracles of the theory. Those are the things that the theory explicitly does not explain. It assumes those assumptions. It explains other things in terms of those. And so science can never offer a theory of everything. And my interpretation of Gödel's incompleteness theorem is that the range of mathematical truths, and therefore just truths in general, is beyond anything that could be captured by a finite theory with a finite set of axioms. So science is doing something important. In spiritual traditions, they talk about using words as pointers to the truth. And I think what science can do is refine our pointers and give us far clearer pointers than we've ever had, even in the spiritual tradition. So I think that's where we'll get a nice complement of activity between the spiritual and the science. The science will be able to give us much more clear pointers, where the pointers tell you where they stop. See, that's the neat thing. When the pointer is so specific and rigorous and precise that it tells you, I go this far and no further. Like evolution by natural selection says, you don't see the truth, but I can't tell you what the truth is. Physics now tells us space-time is doomed, is not fundamental, but I can't tell you what is fundamental. But it does tell us where it stops. And so we're going to get this nice, I think, dialogue between science and spirituality, where the rigor of science, without the hubris that we could have a theory of everything, right? We'll have to let go of that hubris. And I think Gödel sort of gave us the warning sign that we can't be hubristic about this. It's always going to be a very modest next step. But that makes sense, in which, as you say, if consciousness is fundamental and it's the formless that's fundamental, consciousness is exploring all the varieties of form, and that's an endless exploration. And that's effectively what we're part of right now. We're part of that exploration. And what's very interesting to me is hints that could explain why we see things like time and entropy. So for example, if we have a model of consciousness that we call a theory of conscious agents. And in that model, it's possible for us to have these conscious agents in a dynamics that has no entropy. No change, no increase in entropy, right? So the entropy is just fixed. That means there's no entropic time. This model of consciousness is timeless, in the sense that there is no increase in entropy and therefore no entropic time. But what's very interesting is, if consciousness wants to understand itself, one way it could do that is to take a perspective, a projection of itself. So look at itself from a particular projection. And you can prove, it's very, very simple. It's a 3-line proof that once you take a perspective, even though the original system has no entropic time, the perspective system does. The very act of taking a perspective, you can prove very, very simply, leads to that system appearing to have increasing entropy from that point of view. So this is going to be, again, a very fascinating direction to pursue. Now, I think that the model that we have of consciousness is just the 1.0 model, right? There'll be a 2.0, a 10.0, a 1,000.0, and so forth. Science will go on, but even our first baby models are already suggesting this interesting possibility that consciousness itself need not have entropic time, but any perspective on it will lead to an entropic time, and therefore lead to all the things that we have to do to deal with decay, like evolution by natural selection, feeding ourselves, grooming ourselves, all the stuff that we have to do in this virtual reality is because projection leads to entropy.
I'm sure Jennifer has some questions, but I have two, but maybe Jennifer, you have some comments before that.
I have a question, Deepak, that ties into your most recent book on total meditation, before, of course, your upcoming book, Abundance. On total meditation, you spend a lot of time talking about the power of meditation and moving into these altered states of consciousness to connect to consciousness itself, as we were talking about earlier, both from the scientific and the Vedantic perspective. My question to both of you, whichever one of you would like to answer it first, is could consciousness in meditation, perhaps, if you hit a perfect pure state of consciousness, solve the problem of consciousness if you hit a frequency of that level of purity, whether it's a mathematical formula? Einstein and many of the famous scientists of the past have explored a lot of these altered states to come up with some of these theories of consciousness and different other theories of evolution. Is that a possibility that we could actually solve this problem using consciousness itself through perhaps even meditation?
So let me answer that indirectly, probably, because I have a very rigorous practice of meditation, several hours sometimes. I also meditate on personal death every night by letting go of every experience I've had, saying it's already gone, so it's dead. Letting go of every memory, every thought consciously, so it's gone. And then I do something called Yoga Nidra, and that is a combination of techniques, but basically progressively shut out my experiences of the sensory world. So as soon as I close my eyes, the physical world has disappeared. All you're experiencing when you're closing your eyes, the experience of the physical world has disappeared. Even the experience of the physical body disappears because I experience, when I withdraw the senses, and this is a technique called pratyahara in part of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So you progressively withdraw each sense. As you withdraw visual experience, the physical form has disappeared, even your own body. All you experience is sounds, if you're aware of them. Then you experience sensations in your body. And then you, of course, experience thoughts. And you also experience images, imagination. I think of my mother, and suddenly her form appears, or a memory appears, or even the sound of a voice appears. But as I withdraw from each of these at night and get to a state where I can honestly say I experience myself as existing, but with no body and no mind. Absolutely. And there's the certainty of existence minus experience, but with the potential of experience. Okay. So that is.
Can you go into inquiry when you're in that state, Deepak? So if you're in that state of no body, no physical form, no mind, is then you asking the question, you going back into the mind, or could you come from a state of pure consciousness to then go into inquiry in that state?
No, you start with inquiry. So I start with inquiry. Who am I? Am I the changing body, or am I the awareness in which the changing body is an experience? Am I the changing mind, or am I the awareness in which the changing mind is an experience? Am I emotions, or am I the awareness in which the changing emotions is an experience? Am I a thought, or am I the awareness in which thoughts come and go? And the more I inquire into that, it's obvious that there's a non-changing factor in every experience, which we call I. So I was a baby, I was a child, I was a teenager. I had these thoughts, and I had the emotions of an 8-year-old, and then I evolved. Otherwise, I could have run for president. So all of those things come as a part of inquiry. And then what I do is I start to slowly withdraw the senses, and then use subtle techniques like soundless mantras that transcend all experience to the source of all experience. And when you transcend all experience, you realize that all experience is just that: sensory perceptions, images, imagination, feelings, which how I interpret my images and my sensory experience is emotions and thoughts. And that's the sum total of all experience. Now, when Don was speaking, I did have one interesting thought, and that is, when Don speaks about equations and Gödel's theorem, he's not talking about anything in the realm of sensory experience at all. So, when we do normal science, there's a word called scientific realism, or it's also called naive realism. Naive realism holds that the physical world exists exactly like it looks to human beings, period. And that it would continue to exist exactly what it looks like to human beings, even if human beings were not there. So that, when you look at that, it's silly actually, but it works. It works to create technology. It works to create everything. And quantum mechanics goes even further. But then even in quantum mechanics, there are aspects of realism, the particles that appear. I was looking at the other day, the definition of elementary particles. There's the impermanent appearance of energetic particles as determined by the uncertainty principle. So even when we look at particle physics, you say, is it a wave? In which case it's not material. It's a possibility. Is it a particle? Well, it's a thing. And it's what we call a thing is the reification of actually an idea. When you look at a Higgs boson, or you look at whatever, these particles and subatomic particles, you still have to look at them. You freeze frame in the Hadron Collider the appearance of something. It's a flicker of something, call it the Higgs boson, and you say, oh, this gives mass to the universe, and the equations work out. But in general, I think if you go a little bit beyond quantum mechanics into the equations that Don is speaking about, equations are both ways, so there's no arrow of time at that level. And, entropy can stop when you go to briefly, when you have the experience of transcendence or bodiless existence. But I think the counter to entropy and the arrow of time is what we call life. So all the time there's entropy happening, but there's also life emerging. I don't want to use esoteric terms like reincarnation, but what consciousness is doing is recycling experience through memory and imagination, but the memory and imagination don't exist as physical entities. They exist as movements of consciousness that reify the perceptions as the physical body, the physical brain, the physical universe. And so there's this dance going on. Now, to finish this, the other day I was speaking to Frank Wilczek, Nobel laureate in physics from MIT, and he's written a book called Fundamentals. And then in the book Fundamentals, he has a chapter on the real fundamentals. So on the real fundamentals, you like this, Don. He says the real fundamentals of the universe are three things: spin, charge, and mass. And then he goes on to say that these are structureless entities. They don't have any dimensionality in space-time. So I said, where do they exist? He said, don't ask me those questions. They exist, but there's no location for spin, charge, and mass. They're just activities of something that is formless and yet structures the whole universe.
Very interesting.
So what is real, really? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. If what you just said are the building blocks and the fundamentals of reality, and yet those things don't have a place in time, then that leaves us all just wondering, what is this thing that we call reality? So Don, any closing thoughts for you today?
I'll just say that I agree also with Deepak. Consciousness is fundamental, and consciousness can know itself by being itself. But the notion of inquiry, from a scientist's point of view, when we say inquiry, I think about making theories. And what Gödel is telling us is that there's no end to making theories. The notion of truth transcends the notion of proof. So by being conscious and being conscious aware, we're being that truth. But that doesn't mean that we can know it in the sense that science likes to know things, right? In the sense of building theories. You can know it by being it, but you can't know it by theorizing. Or to put it another way, science will forever, it's job security. We will forever be coming up with new theories because there's no end to it. So this is good news for scientists. We have job security here, but it's also good news for consciousness. What is consciousness up to? In principle, there's no end to the inquiry of self-awareness in principle. So that, if we ask what is consciousness up to, you might say, well, if it's exploring itself, it'll be done. No, in principle, you can never be done because you can never know yourself completely. So that's the interesting thing. Consciousness will always be exploring, and what we're doing here is just a tiny little part of that grand exploration.
Beautiful, Don. Closing thoughts from you, Deepak?
No, I think what's real is the formless, and being formless, it has to be infinite. So the Vedanta says, if you can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, think about it, conceptualize it, and imagine it, it's not real. It's based on something that is totally non-conceptualizable, but without it, there would be no concepts, no imagination, no perception. So the truth, whatever it is, cannot be expressed in words. Perhaps in mathematical symbols, we can get closer.
Beautiful, Deepak. Well, if you guys are game, perhaps we could call this show, What is Real, Really? The New Frontier of Consciousness, explored from a Vedantic and scientific perspective.
I like that. What do you think, Don?
Perfect.
Yeah, and
Awesome.
when it's done, let us have it so we can also promote it on social media.
Very
Thanks,
good.
Don. I'll be in touch with you, Don, soon.
Very, very good. And I look forward to actually being able to do it in person pretty soon, but maybe another couple months.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds great,
Thanks,
guys.
man.
I'll do the
Thank you.
pre-show stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.